In the world of construction, there are projects that challenge the limits of human capability, and then there are projects that seem to defy the very laws of physics and common sense. What happens when a simple mason from the industrial heartland of America receives an offer that could either elevate him to legendary status or destroy everything he has ever worked for? This is the true, unbelievable story of Marcus Thompson, a man whose calloused hands and unwavering determination led him to accept the most dangerous and controversial construction challenge in American history. A story of corporate conspiracy, life-threatening conditions, and one man's courage to stand against forces far more powerful than himself. What Marcus discovered in the depths of the Grand Canyon would not only nearly cost him his life, but would expose a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of American business and government. Chapter 1. Marcus Thompson entered this world on a bitterly cold February morning in 1965 in a small maternity ward in downtown Detroit, Michigan. Outside the hospital windows, the smokestacks of the automotive factories painted the sky in shades of gray and orange, a backdrop that would define his entire childhood. His father, Robert Thompson, was a third-generation factory worker at the Ford River Rouge complex, a man whose hands were permanently stained with engine oil and whose back was bent from 25 years of assembly line labor. Marcus's mother, Dorothy, worked double shifts at a textile factory during the week and cleaned office buildings on weekends. The Thompson family lived in a two-bedroom house on Corktown, where the sound of trains and factory whistles served as a constant reminder that in Detroit, you either worked with your hands or you didn't work at all. From the moment Marcus could walk, he showed an unusual fascination with how things were built. While other children played with toys, Marcus would spend hours stacking wooden blocks, always trying to build something higher, stronger, more complex than what he had built before. His parents would often find him in the backyard, using discarded pieces of wood and metal to construct elaborate structures that seemed to defy his age and experience. When Marcus turned 12, his father made a decision that would change the boy's life forever. Instead of spending another summer watching his son waste away in front of the television, Robert decided to bring Marcus to work with him on weekends, but not to the factory, to the construction sites where Robert earned extra money as a part-time laborer. The first time Marcus stepped onto a construction site, something clicked inside his mind like tumblers falling into place in a lock. The organized chaos, the smell of fresh concrete, the sound of power tools, the sight of grown men working together to create something permanent and meaningful, it all spoke to something deep in his soul that he couldn't yet understand, but knew was fundamental to who he was meant to become. Marcus's hands were small and soft that first day, but by the end of the summer, they had developed the first calluses that would eventually become as much a part of his identity as his own fingerprints. Robert Thompson watched his son transform from a typical city kid into something special, something focused and driven that even seasoned construction workers began to notice and respect. By the time Marcus turned 16, he was no longer just helping on weekends. He was working alongside men twice his age, carrying cement bags that weighed nearly as much as he did, mixing concrete by hand when the machinery broke down, and learning the ancient art of masonry from Italian immigrants who had been laying bricks since before Marcus was born. The old-timers on the construction sites began calling him the Kid, but it wasn't said with condescension. It was said with the kind of respect that hard-working men reserve for someone who proves themselves through sweat and determination rather than words and promises. Marcus had what they called the touch, an almost supernatural ability to know exactly how much mortar to use, exactly how to place each brick so that the wall would not only be strong, but would last for generations. Marcus graduated from high school in 1983. But unlike his classmates who went off to college or factory jobs, he already knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He spent the next 12 years building his reputation throughout Detroit and the surrounding areas, working on everything from small residential repairs to major commercial projects. His business cards were simple and direct. Marcus Thompson, Mason. If it needs to be built right, call me. By 1995, Marcus had established Thompson Masonry as one of the most respected small construction companies in Michigan. He employed 8 full-time workers, all of whom had been hand-picked not just for their skills, but for their character and work ethic. Marcus paid his employees better than most companies, twice his size, and in return, he demanded perfection in every project, no matter how small. Marcus's reputation was built on more than just technical skill. He had an almost legendary ability to solve problems that left engineers scratching their heads and reaching for their calculators. When the contractors rebuilding the Michigan Central Station faced a structural challenge that seemed impossible to overcome, they called Marcus. When the city of Detroit needed someone to repair the historic Masonic temple's crumbling facade without damaging the irreplaceable architectural details, they called Marcus. He wasn't just a mason, he was a problem solver, an artist who worked in stone and mortar instead of paint and canvas. It was this reputation that brought Robert Harrison to Marcus's door on that cold Tuesday morning in March 1996. Marcus was in his trailer office, reviewing blueprints for a downtown Detroit renovation project while enjoying his morning coffee. Black, strong, and hot enough to wake the dead. The trailer itself was a reflection of Marcus's personality, functional, organized, and completely focused on getting the job done. The walls were covered with photographs from completed projects, safety certifications, and a hand-drawn picture from his 8-year-old daughter Emma that read, "My dad builds everything." When the black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the construction site, Marcus knew immediately that whoever was inside wasn't there for a routine consultation. In his neighborhood, cars like that usually meant either very good news or very bad trouble, and there wasn't much middle ground between the two. Robert Harrison stepped out of the car like a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. Expensive suit, Italian leather shoes, and a handshake that was firm without being threatening. He was followed by a younger man who carried himself like an attorney and said nothing during the entire conversation. "Mr. Thompson," Harrison said, settling into the folding chair across from Marcus's desk as if it were a throne. "I've heard remarkable things about your work. They say you can solve problems that other people consider impossible." Marcus studied the man carefully. In his experience, when wealthy strangers started conversations with flattery, they usually ended with requests that were either illegal, impossible, or both. "I solve construction problems, Mr. Harrison. If you've got a building that needs to be built or fixed, I'm your man. If you're looking for something else, you're in the wrong place." Harrison smiled, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Direct. "I like that. Mr. Thompson, what I'm about to propose to you is completely legal, completely legitimate, and completely unlike anything you've ever done before. Are you interested in making more money in 18 months than you've made in your entire career up to this point?" Marcus set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Harrison, I've been doing this long enough to know that when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. What exactly are you proposing?" Harrison reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents and photographs. As he spread them across Marcus's desk, the scale of what he was proposing became clear. The photographs showed the Grand Canyon from angles Marcus had never seen before, taken from helicopters and specialized equipment that revealed the true enormity of the landscape. "The Grand Canyon's Suspension Bridge Project," Harrison said, his voice taking on the tone of a man describing something religious. "A bridge spanning one of the most challenging sections of the canyon, connecting the north and south rims with a suspended structure that will be both a feat of engineering and a tourist attraction that will draw visitors from around the world. Marcus studied the photographs and preliminary blueprints with the trained eye of a man who had spent his entire adult life evaluating construction challenges. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The proposed bridge would span nearly 2 miles of open air, suspended over a gorge that dropped more than 4,000 feet to the Colorado River below. The wind conditions alone would be unlike anything any construction crew had ever faced. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said slowly, "I have to ask, why hasn't this project been completed already? A project like this would normally be handled by one of the major engineering firms, not a small masonry company from Detroit." Harrison's smile became more genuine, as if Marcus had asked exactly the question he was hoping to hear. "That's an excellent question, Mr. Thompson. The truth is, this project has been attempted 3 times by 3 different engineering teams. All of them failed. The conditions are so extreme that most companies consider it impossible to complete. And yet, you're asking me to try. I'm asking you to succeed where others have failed. Your reputation for solving impossible problems has reached certain circles in our industry. We believe that what this project needs isn't more engineering theory or computer models. It needs someone with practical experience, someone who understands how to make things work in the real world rather than on paper." Marcus looked at the contract Harrison placed on his desk. The numbers were staggering. More money than he had ever seen in one place, enough to secure his family's future for generations. But the fine print was equally staggering. If Marcus failed to complete the project within the specified time frame, he would be personally responsible for all costs incurred, which could amount to millions of dollars. "Mr. Harrison, this contract basically says that if I fail, I lose everything I own, and probably spend the rest of my life in debt." "That's correct, Mr. Thompson. But it also says that if you succeed, you'll never have to worry about money again. The question is, do you have enough confidence in your abilities to take that risk?" Marcus looked at the photograph of Sarah and Emma on his desk. His wife was a nurse at Detroit General Hospital, working long shifts to help support their family while Marcus built his business. Emma was in 3rd grade, already showing signs of the same determination and intelligence that had driven Marcus to success. They deserved better than the modest life he could provide as a small-town mason. But they also deserved a husband and father who came home every night. Marcus Thompson had spent his entire life taking calculated risks. He had started his own business when everyone told him he was too young. He had bid on projects that other contractors considered too challenging. He had built his reputation by saying yes when everyone else said no. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, reaching for his pen, "when do we start?" Chapter 2. 3 weeks later, Marcus Thompson found himself standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon at sunrise, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what the word impossible meant. No photograph, no blueprint, no description could have prepared him for the sheer, overwhelming scale of what lay before him. The canyon stretched in every direction, like a wound in the earth that went down so far that the bottom disappeared into shadows and morning mist. The wind at the canyon's edge was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. It didn't just blow. It seemed to have a personality, changing direction without warning, carrying sounds from miles away, and creating pressure differentials that could knock a full-grown man off his feet. And this was on a calm day. Marcus had arrived in Arizona with a crew of 12 experienced workers, men he had worked with for years and trusted with his life. Jimmy Rodriguez, his foreman, had been with Marcus since the beginning. Billy Murphy, a crane operator from Boston who could place a steel beam within an inch of where it needed to be. Frank Kowalski, an electrician who could wire anything from a house to a skyscraper. These were men who had seen it all and done it all, but as they stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon that first morning, Marcus could see doubt creeping into their eyes. "Boss," Jimmy said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like this. How are we supposed to work in these conditions?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question. The preliminary surveys had mentioned challenging wind conditions, but the reality was far beyond what any of them had anticipated. The canyon created its own weather system, with wind patterns that seemed to follow no logical rules. One moment, the air would be perfectly still, and the next, gusts strong enough to lift a small truck would come roaring up from the depths of the canyon without any warning. The base camp that Titan Construction had established was located on the south rim, about 2 miles from the actual construction site. It consisted of a dozen trailers for sleeping quarters, a larger trailer that served as a mess hall and meeting room, and several storage buildings for equipment and materials. The closest town was Flagstaff, over an hour away by car, which meant that once the crew was on site, they were completely isolated from civilization. Marcus spent the first week studying the plans and trying to understand exactly what Titan Construction expected him to accomplish. The proposed bridge was a suspension bridge design, with 2 main towers that would rise nearly 800 feet above the canyon rim. The main cables would be anchored on both sides of the canyon and would support a roadway deck that would span 10,847 feet of open air. But the more Marcus studied the plans, the more concerned he became. The engineering calculations seemed sound, but there were details that didn't make sense to someone with his practical experience. The specifications called for certain types of steel and concrete that were designed for normal construction conditions, not for the extreme environment of the Grand Canyon. When Marcus tried to contact the project engineers at Titan Construction to discuss these concerns, he was told that all engineering decisions had been finalized and that his job was to follow the specifications exactly as written. Any deviations from the plans would void his contract and make him liable for all costs. The first major challenge came during the second week, when they attempted to begin construction of the foundation for the South Rim Tower. The plans called for excavating a foundation pit 30 feet deep and 60 feet square, which seemed straightforward enough. But what the plans didn't account for was the unique geological structure of the canyon rim. The rock formations at the Grand Canyon are layered like a geological history book, with different types of stone stacked on top of each other in patterns that have been developing for millions of years. Some layers are hard granite that can support enormous weight, while others are softer sandstone that crumbles at the touch. The plans seem to assume that the foundation would be built entirely on solid granite, but the actual site contained layers of both hard and soft rock that would require completely different construction approaches. Marcus and his crew spent 3 days trying to excavate the foundation according to the original specifications, before realizing that following the plans exactly would result in a foundation that would collapse under its own weight long before any bridge could be built on top of it. "This is crazy, boss," Jimmy said as they stood in the partially excavated foundation pit on Thursday afternoon. These plans were drawn by people who never set foot on this site. "We can't build a foundation like this on this type of ground." Marcus knew Jimmy was right, but he also knew that deviating from the plans could cost him everything he owned. That night, he called Robert Harrison at Titan Construction and explained the situation in detail. Harrison's response was polite but firm: follow the plans exactly or face the consequences of breaching the contract. It was during the 3rd week that the accidents began. The first incident happened on a Monday morning when Tommy Rodriguez, Jimmy's younger brother and one of the most careful workers Marcus had ever known, was operating a small crane to move materials from the supply truck to the construction site. A sudden gust of wind caught the load he was carrying, a pallet of concrete blocks weighing nearly 2 tons, and swung it directly toward the cab of the crane where Tommy was sitting. Tommy had less than 2 seconds to react. He threw himself from the crane cab just as the pallet of blocks smashed through the windshield and crushed the operator's seat where he had been sitting moments before. Tommy escaped with only cuts and bruises, but the message was clear. The Grand Canyon was not going to make this easy. The second incident happened 2 days later when Frank Kowalski was installing electrical conduit in the foundation pit. The wind patterns at the canyon created pressure differentials that could make tools and materials behave in completely unpredictable ways. Frank was using a pneumatic drill when a sudden change in air pressure caused the drill to jump out of his hands and nearly take off 3 of his fingers. By the end of the 3rd week, every man on Marcus's crew had experienced at least one close call that could easily have been fatal. The combination of extreme wind conditions, unpredictable weather, and construction challenges that seemed designed to test the limits of human capability was taking its toll on everyone's nerves. Marcus could see the fear in his men's eyes, and he couldn't blame them. These were experienced construction workers who had faced dangerous conditions before, but the Grand Canyon was unlike anything any of them had encountered. Every day brought new challenges that the original plans had never anticipated, and every solution they implemented seemed to create 3 new problems. But it wasn't just the physical dangers that were wearing on the crew. There was something about the isolation, the vast emptiness of the canyon, and the constant awareness that they were suspended over a drop that could kill them instantly that began to affect everyone's mental state. Men who had worked together for years began snapping at each other over minor issues. Sleep became difficult when every gust of wind sounded like an approaching disaster. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon during the 4th week. Tommy Rodriguez was working on the foundation wall, carefully placing concrete blocks according to the specifications, when the unthinkable happened. A combination of wind shear and unstable ground caused the section of foundation he was standing on to shift suddenly. Tommy found himself sliding toward the edge of the canyon, desperately trying to grab onto something solid enough to stop his fall. For 47 minutes, Tommy hung by his safety harness over a drop that went down nearly half a mile to the Colorado River. The rescue equipment had to be carefully positioned to avoid the same wind conditions that had caused the accident, and every minute that passed felt like an hour to the men working frantically to save their friend's life. When they finally pulled Tommy to safety, he was shaking so violently that he couldn't speak for nearly an hour. That night, as Marcus sat with Tommy in the medical trailer, he made a decision that he knew would probably end his career. "Tommy," Marcus said quietly, "if you want to leave, I won't hold it against you. This isn't what any of us signed up for." Tommy looked at Marcus with tears in his eyes. "Boss, I got 3 kids and a wife back in Detroit. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." One by one, over the next week, the rest of the crew came to Marcus with the same message. They respected him, they trusted him, but they couldn't risk their lives for a project that seemed designed to kill them. By the beginning of the 5th week, Marcus was left with only 3 workers. Jake Miller, a veteran iron worker with over 30 years of experience who had seen everything and feared nothing. Carlos Mendoza, a 25-year-old crane operator who had more courage than common sense. And himself, 4 men to complete a project that had originally required 50. But the worst revelation was still to come. As Marcus reviewed the progress reports and tried to figure out how to continue with such a reduced crew, he began to notice discrepancies in the materials that were being delivered to the site. The steel cables that arrived were marked with the correct specifications, but when Marcus measured them himself, they were slightly thinner than what the plans called for. The concrete blocks were the right size and shape, but they seemed lighter than they should be. Marcus had spent enough years in construction to know that when materials don't match specifications, it's usually not an accident. What do you think about what Marcus was discovering? Would you have had the courage to continue with only 3 men, or would you have found a way to abandon the project? Let us know in the comments what you would do in this impossible situation. Chapter 3. The morning of March 15th, 1996 began with an eerie calm that any experienced construction worker would have recognized as a warning sign. Marcus Thompson woke up in his trailer at 4:30 a.m., as he had every morning for the past 6 weeks, but something felt fundamentally different about the air outside. The usual howling wind that had become the soundtrack to their lives had died to a whisper, and the sky had taken on a strange yellowish color that reminded Marcus of the moments before a severe thunderstorm back in Michigan. Jake Miller was already awake, standing outside his trailer and staring up at the sky with the expression of a man who had seen too much to be optimistic about anything. At 62 years old, Jake had worked on construction projects in every state in the Union and several foreign countries. He had survived construction accidents that had killed other men, worked through blizzards, hurricanes, and heat waves that would have sent younger workers running for shelter. But as he stood there in the pre-dawn light of the Grand Canyon, Marcus could see something in Jake's eyes that he had never seen before: genuine fear. "Boss," Jake said as Marcus approached, his voice hoarse from breathing desert dust for weeks, "I've been doing this since before you were born, and I've never seen weather conditions like what's coming our way today. The pressure is all wrong. The wind is too quiet. Something big is building up out there, and when it hits, it's going to hit hard." Carlos Mendoza emerged from his trailer, looking like he hadn't slept at all. At 25, Carlos was young enough to still believe that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. But 6 weeks in the Grand Canyon had aged him in ways that were visible in his eyes and the set of his shoulders. "What's the plan for today, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Marcus looked at the work schedule he had spent the previous evening revising for the 100th time. With only 3 workers, every task took 3 times longer than it should, and they were falling further behind schedule every day. Today's plan called for installing the primary support cables for the bridge's main span, a job that required perfect weather conditions and absolute precision. One mistake could not only destroy weeks of work, but could easily kill everyone involved. "The plan is to assess conditions hour by hour," Marcus said, folding the work schedule and putting it in his pocket. "If the weather stays stable, we proceed with the cable installation. If conditions deteriorate, we secure everything and wait it out." But even as Marcus said the words, he knew they didn't have the luxury of waiting. Titan Construction had made it clear that any further delays would result in contract termination and financial penalties that would destroy not only Marcus, but his family. The pressure to continue working, regardless of conditions, was becoming unbearable. At 7:30 a.m., the 3 men gathered at the construction site to begin what would become the most dangerous day of Marcus Thompson's life. The main support cable they needed to install was a masterpiece of engineering, a steel cable 4 inches in diameter and weighing over 8 tons, designed to support the entire weight of the bridge's roadway deck. Installing it required precisely positioning both ends of the cable and then using hydraulic tensioning equipment to stretch it to exactly the right tension across the canyon. The process began smoothly. Carlos operated the crane that lifted one end of the cable into position, while Jake and Marcus worked on the south rim anchor point. The cable moved slowly and steadily across the canyon, suspended by temporary support cables, exactly as the engineering plans specified. But at 9:47 a.m., everything changed in an instant. The wind that Jake had been worried about arrived not as a gradual increase in intensity, but as a sudden, violent explosion of air that seemed to come from every direction at once. One moment, the air was still enough to hear a pin drop, and the next, Marcus found himself in the middle of what felt like a tornado that had somehow learned to blow sideways. The wind hit the partially installed cable with a force that no one had anticipated. The cable began to vibrate like a massive guitar string, creating a deep, humming sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The vibrations traveled along the cable to the anchor points, causing the entire support structure to shake violently. Marcus was on the main platform, personally overseeing the tensioning process, when he noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The bolts that were supposed to secure the platform to the canyon rim were not the high-tensile steel bolts specified in the blueprints. They were ordinary construction bolts, the kind used for routine building projects, completely inadequate for the extreme stresses of a bridge construction project. But that wasn't the worst part. As Marcus looked more closely at the bolts, he realized that some of them were already beginning to bend under the strain of the wind-induced vibrations. The platform he was standing on, which was supposed to be the most secure part of the entire construction site, was about to collapse. "Jake! Carlos!" Marcus shouted over the roar of the wind. "Get away from the platform! The anchor bolts are failing!" Jake Miller had survived 30 years of construction work by trusting his instincts and moving fast when things went wrong. He didn't waste time asking questions or looking for confirmation. He grabbed Carlos by the arm and began running toward the canyon rim, away from the platform that was now shaking so violently that tools and materials were being thrown into the air. Marcus tried to follow them, but he was too far from the edge of the platform when the bolts finally gave way. The platform tilted sharply toward the canyon, and Marcus found himself sliding toward a drop that would certainly be fatal. He managed to grab onto a support beam just as the platform broke completely free from its moorings and plunged into the canyon, taking with it thousands of dollars worth of equipment and nearly taking Marcus with it. For a moment that seemed to last forever. Marcus hung by his hands over the Grand Canyon, with nothing but 4,000 feet of empty air between him and the Colorado River. The wind was trying to tear him loose from his grip, and he could feel his strength beginning to fail. His safety harness had been damaged in the collapse, and the emergency cables that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of accident were nowhere within reach. It was Jake Miller who saved Marcus's life. Despite being over 60 years old and having every reason to prioritize his own safety, Jake ran back to the edge of the collapsed platform and managed to lower a rope to Marcus just as his grip was beginning to fail. The rescue took nearly an hour, with Jake and Carlos working together to pull Marcus up while fighting wind gusts that threatened to knock all of them into the canyon. When Marcus finally reached solid ground, he was injured but alive. 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion that left him dizzy and nauseous for hours. But he was breathing, and that was more than he had any right to expect after what had just happened. It was while Marcus was lying on the ground, waiting for the helicopter that would take him to the hospital in Phoenix, that he had the clearest moment of understanding of his entire life. This wasn't about construction. This wasn't about engineering challenges or extreme weather conditions. This was about insurance fraud on a massive scale. The defective bolts weren't a mistake or a cost-cutting measure. They were deliberately chosen to fail under stress, ensuring that the project would collapse in a dramatic and highly visible way. The insurance payout from such a failure would be enormous, far more than the actual cost of the project. And Marcus Thompson, the simple mason from Detroit who had believed he was being hired for his expertise, was never meant to succeed. He was meant to be the fall guy, the contractor who would be blamed when the project failed, allowing Titan Construction to collect the insurance money while avoiding any legal responsibility. As the helicopter lifted off from the Grand Canyon, carrying Marcus toward the hospital, he made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He could remain silent about what he had discovered, return to Detroit, and try to rebuild his life. Or he could fight back, knowing that by doing so, he would be going to war with people who had already proven they were willing to risk his life for money. Marcus Thompson had never walked away from a fight in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. Thank you for staying with us this far in Marcus's incredible journey. Your engagement and comments mean everything to us, and we promise you that the best and most shocking parts of this story are yet to come. What Marcus discovered next would not only put his life in immediate danger, but would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of American business and government. Chapter 4. The phone call that would change everything came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday night, cutting through the silence of Marcus Thompson's hospital room in Phoenix like a knife through flesh. Marcus had been released from the intensive care unit 2 days earlier, but his body was still recovering from the trauma of the accident. His ribs ached with every breath, his left shoulder was immobilized in a sling, and the concussion had left him with headaches that felt like hammers pounding inside his skull. But when the phone rang in the middle of the night, Marcus was instantly awake, his construction worker's instincts telling him that middle-of-the-night phone calls were rarely good news. "Mr. Thompson," the voice on the other end was cold, professional, and completely devoid of any human warmth. It sounded like someone reading from a script, someone who had made calls like this before and would make them again. "I hope you're recovering well from your accident. Accidents can be so unpredictable, can't they?" "Who is this?" Marcus asked, although he already had a sinking feeling that he knew. "Let's just say I represent certain interests that are concerned about your continued involvement in the Grand Canyon project. You've seen things that weren't meant to be seen, Mr. Thompson. You've asked questions that weren't meant to be asked. It would be wise for you to consider this a learning experience and return to your normal life in Detroit. Your family misses you." The mention of his family sent a chill down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the hospital room. Sarah and Emma weren't just mentioned casually. They were mentioned specifically, deliberately, as a threat that couldn't be misinterpreted. "If you're threatening my family," Marcus began, but the line went dead before he could finish the sentence. Marcus stared at the phone for several minutes, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. Someone knew where he was. Someone knew about his family, and someone was worried enough about what he might do with his knowledge to make threats in the middle of the night. The next morning, despite the protests of his doctors and nurses, Marcus checked himself out of the hospital and drove back to the Grand Canyon construction site. What he found there confirmed his worst suspicions and opened his eyes to the full scope of the conspiracy he had stumbled into. All evidence of the sabotage materials had been removed. The defective bolts that had caused the platform collapse had been replaced with the correct high-tensile steel specifications. The damaged support structures had been repaired or replaced entirely. To anyone investigating the accident, it would appear that Marcus Thompson had simply made an error in judgment, working in dangerous conditions that any reasonable contractor would have avoided. But Marcus had something that the people behind the cover-up didn't know about. During his fall, in that split second when he realized the platform was collapsing, he had managed to grab one of the defective bolts. It was now hidden in a safety deposit box at a Phoenix bank, along with photographs he had secretly taken of the altered blueprints and material specifications. The evidence was small, but it was irrefutable proof that the Grand Canyon project had been deliberately sabotaged. Over the next several days, as Marcus recovered from his injuries and tried to figure out his next move, he began to piece together the full scope of what he was up against. The more he investigated, the more he realized that the Grand Canyon project wasn't an isolated incident. Marcus spent hours in the Phoenix Public Library using their computers to research Titan Construction and Robert Harrison. What he discovered was a pattern of similar projects stretching back nearly a decade. Construction projects that were technically challenging but not impossible, all of which had failed in spectacular and highly publicized ways, and all of which had resulted in massive insurance payouts for Titan Construction. The Mackinac Straits Bridge Extension project in Michigan failed due to unprecedented weather conditions, resulting in a $40 million insurance settlement. The Golden Gate Park underground parking structure in San Francisco collapsed during construction due to unforeseen geological conditions, resulting in a $60 million payout. The list went on and on, each project following the same pattern. Accept a challenging but legitimate contract, deliberately sabotage the construction with inferior materials or altered specifications, and then collect insurance money when the project inevitably failed. The beauty of the scheme was that the failures always appeared to be the result of the genuine challenges inherent in the projects. Insurance investigators would see dangerous working conditions, extreme weather, and difficult engineering requirements, and they would conclude that the failures were unfortunate but understandable. The idea that a major construction company would deliberately sabotage its own projects was so outrageous that it would never occur to most investigators. But Marcus Thompson wasn't most people. He was a construction worker who had spent his entire career solving problems that other people considered impossible, and he recognized the difference between a genuine engineering challenge and deliberate sabotage. The problem was that recognizing the truth and proving it were two entirely different things. Marcus tried to contact the FBI, but his calls were either never returned or were transferred to agents who seemed more interested in discouraging his investigation than in pursuing it. He reached out to journalists at several major newspapers, but most of them lost interest as soon as they realized the story would require months of investigation and would pit them against a major corporation with unlimited legal resources. The few journalists who did show initial interest in the story had a strange habit of suddenly becoming unavailable after a day or two. Phone calls weren't returned, meetings were cancelled, and one reporter from the Arizona Republic told Marcus bluntly that he had been advised by his editor to focus on other stories. It was becoming clear that Titan Construction's influence reached far beyond the construction industry. They had connections with insurance companies, relationships with government regulators, and enough financial resources to make problems disappear before they became public knowledge. The breaking point came when Marcus received a package at his hotel. Inside was a photograph of Emma, his 8-year-old daughter, walking out of Lincoln Elementary School in Detroit. She was wearing her favorite purple backpack and had a smile on her face that made Marcus's heart ache with homesickness and terror in equal measure. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in red ink, "Beautiful children are so fragile. Accidents happen every day." That night, Marcus Thompson sat in his hotel room and faced the most important decision of his life. He could pack his bags, return to Detroit, and pretend that nothing had happened. His family would be safe. He could rebuild his construction business, and the people responsible for the fraud would continue their scheme until they decided to retire with their millions of dollars in stolen insurance money. Or he could fight back, knowing that by doing so, he would be risking everything he held dear against people who had already proven they were willing to commit crimes to protect their interests. Marcus looked at his reflection in the hotel bathroom mirror. His face was still swollen and discolored from the accident. His left arm was in a sling, and his ribs ached with every movement. He was just a mason from Detroit, going up against one of the most powerful and ruthless corporations in America. But Marcus Thompson had built his entire life on the principle that some things were more important than personal safety. His reputation had been built on saying yes when other people said no, on solving problems that other people considered impossible, on doing what was right instead of what was easy. The people who had threatened his family had made one critical error. They had assumed that Marcus Thompson was like other people, that he could be intimidated into silence by threats and consequences. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. Marcus picked up the phone and dialed a number he had found in his research. Rebecca Martinez was an investigative journalist with the Phoenix Herald who specialized in corporate fraud and corruption. Unlike the other journalists Marcus had contacted, Rebecca had a reputation for taking on powerful interests and seeing investigations through to the end, regardless of the personal cost. "Ms. Martinez," Marcus said when she answered the phone, "my name is Marcus Thompson, and I have a story that's going to change your life. But I have to warn you, it's also probably going to put your life in danger. Are you interested?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Rebecca Martinez said, "Mr. Thompson, danger comes with the territory in my line of work. Tell me what you've got." That phone call would set in motion a chain of events that would not only expose one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in American history, but would also prove that sometimes one person's courage to do what's right can bring down even the most powerful and corrupt organizations. Chapter 5. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in Federal Courtroom 7A in Denver, Colorado, facing a panel of 3 federal judges and a gallery packed with journalists, federal agents, and spectators who had followed what had become known as the Gran Cañón conspiracy through months of investigation, arrests, and legal proceedings. The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet hum of air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers, as attorneys prepared for what everyone knew would be the most important testimony in the entire case. The path from that hotel room phone call to this federal courtroom had been paved with sleepless nights, constant danger, and a level of determination that Marcus himself hadn't known he possessed. What had started as one man's quest for justice had become a federal investigation involving multiple agencies, dozens of suspects, and evidence of corruption that reached levels of government and business that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Rebecca Martinez had been everything Marcus had hoped for and more. Within 24 hours of his phone call, she had driven to Marcus's hotel in Phoenix and spent 8 hours listening to his story, examining his evidence, and asking the kind of detailed questions that only someone with years of investigative experience would know to ask. By the end of their first meeting, Rebecca was convinced that Marcus had stumbled onto something much larger than either of them had initially suspected. But Rebecca brought more than just journalistic skills to their partnership. She brought a network of contacts in law enforcement, government, and the business world that Marcus could never have accessed on his own. More importantly, she brought a level of credibility that a construction worker from Detroit could never have achieved on his own. Their first breakthrough came when Rebecca used her contacts at the Arizona Department of Insurance to obtain copies of all insurance claims filed by Titan Construction over the previous 10 years. What they found was a pattern so obvious and so consistent that it was amazing no one had noticed it before. Titan Construction had filed major insurance claims for project failures at a rate nearly 10 times higher than the industry average. The company had collected over $400 million in insurance payouts over the past decade, always for projects that failed due to unprecedented or unforeseeable circumstances. But the real smoking gun came when Rebecca managed to obtain copies of the original engineering reports for several of the failed projects. In every case, the original engineering specifications were sound and appropriate for the challenges involved. The failures had only occurred after the specifications were altered, usually in ways that would be invisible to casual inspection, but would be catastrophic under stress. The pattern was always the same. Titan Construction would accept a legitimately challenging project, secretly alter the specifications to ensure failure, and then collect insurance money when the project collapsed. The altered specifications were always subtle enough that they could be explained away as cost-cutting measures or engineering adjustments, but they were always catastrophic enough to guarantee that the project would fail in a dramatic and highly visible way. Marcus and Rebecca spent 3 weeks traveling across the country, interviewing workers who had been involved in the failed projects, examining records, and building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. What they discovered was more disturbing than either of them had anticipated. Robert Harrison wasn't just the mastermind behind the fraud scheme. He was part of a network of corruption that included insurance executives, government inspectors, and even some federal officials who had been paid to ensure that investigations into the failures were always superficial and inconclusive. The network had been operating for over a decade, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims, while putting the lives of construction workers at risk across the country. Marcus had been just the latest in a long line of contractors who had been hired as fall guys, men who would be blamed for the failures while the real perpetrators collected their money and moved on to the next scheme. But Marcus Thompson had been different from the previous victims. He had survived when he was supposed to die. He had kept evidence when he was supposed to remain silent. And most importantly, he had found someone with the skills and resources to help him expose the truth. The FBI investigation that followed was one of the largest and most complex in the Bureau's history. Federal agents raided Titan construction offices in 12 different states simultaneously, seizing millions of documents, computer records, and financial statements. The evidence they found confirmed everything that Marcus and Rebecca had suspected and revealed details of the conspiracy that were even more shocking than what they had uncovered on their own. Robert Harrison had been running the fraud scheme for over 15 years, generating an estimated $600 million in fraudulent insurance claims. He had corrupted government officials in multiple states, bribed insurance investigators, and even arranged for the elimination of workers who had become suspicious of the operation. The trial that followed was a media sensation that lasted for 4 months and featured testimony from over 200 witnesses. Marcus's testimony, delivered in his characteristic direct and honest style, was so compelling that even Harrison's team of high-powered defense attorneys couldn't shake his credibility. Marcus spent 3 days on the witness stand, walking the jury through every detail of his experience at the Grand Canyon, explaining how he had discovered the sabotage materials, describing the threats he had received, and presenting the evidence he had risked his life to preserve. His testimony was technical enough to be credible to engineering experts and emotional enough to connect with ordinary citizens who understood what it meant to risk everything for the sake of doing what was right. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had physical evidence, documentary proof, recorded conversations, and the testimony of dozens of witnesses who had been involved in various aspects of the conspiracy. Harrison's defense team tried to portray him as a legitimate businessman who had been the victim of overzealous government prosecutors, but the evidence was too clear and too extensive to be explained away. Robert Harrison and 11 other Titan construction executives were convicted on charges including conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and in Harrison's case, conspiracy to commit murder for the death threats against Marcus and his family. Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Titan Construction was ordered to pay over $800 million in fines, restitution, and punitive damages, effectively destroying the company as a business entity. But for Marcus Thompson, the real victory wasn't the money, or the convictions, or the media attention. The real victory came 3 months after the trial, when he received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the director of the American Institute of Construction Safety. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Chen said, "your experience at the Grand Canyon and your courage in exposing this conspiracy have highlighted serious gaps in our industry's safety and oversight procedures. We would like to offer you a position as our Director of Fraud Prevention and Safety Compliance. Your job would be to help prevent other workers from going through what you experienced." Marcus accepted the position and moved his family to Denver, Colorado, where he now works as an independent consultant specializing in construction safety and fraud prevention. His reputation as the man who brought down the Grand Canyon conspiracy has made him one of the most sought-after experts in his field, and he regularly testifies as an expert witness in cases involving construction fraud and safety violations. Emma Thompson, now a sophomore at Colorado State University studying civil engineering, often tells people that her father is her hero not because he was brave, but because he was willing to risk everything to protect people he had never met from dangers they would never know about. She plans to follow in his footsteps, working to make construction sites safer for the men and women who risk their lives every day to build the infrastructure that modern society depends on. Sarah Thompson returned to nursing and now works as a trauma nurse at Denver General Hospital. She says that her husband's experience taught her that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers or politicians, but by ordinary people who simply refuse to look the other way when they encounter injustice. The Grand Canyon Suspension Bridge was eventually completed by Morrison Engineering, a smaller company that specialized in challenging construction projects. Using the original MIT specifications and proper materials, they completed the project 18 months later than originally scheduled, but with a perfect safety record and no cost overruns. The bridge stands today as a testament not only to human engineering capability, but also to the importance of integrity and honesty in construction. Marcus Thompson's story has been told in books, documentaries, and congressional hearings as an example of how one person's courage can expose corruption and prevent future tragedies. But Marcus himself remains modest about his role in the case. "I didn't set out to be a hero," he says. "I just wanted to build a bridge and support my family. When I discovered that people were willing to risk workers' lives for money, I couldn't walk away from that. Sometimes doing what's right isn't about being brave or heroic. Sometimes it's just about being human." Today, Marcus Thompson continues his work as a consultant and expert witness, traveling around the country to help ensure that construction sites are safe and that workers like himself have the protection and support they need to do their jobs without risking their lives for someone else's profit. The construction industry is safer today because one man from Detroit refused to remain silent when he discovered that his life had been put at risk for money. Marcus Thompson proved that sometimes the most impossible challenge isn't building a bridge over the Grand Canyon. Sometimes the most impossible challenge is simply standing up for what's right when the whole world seems to be against you, and the most powerful people in your industry are willing to kill to keep their secrets hidden. His story serves as a reminder that heroism isn't about wearing a cape or having superpowers. Sometimes heroism is simply about having the courage to do what's right, even when doing so could cost you everything you hold dear. What would you have done in Marcus Thompson's place? Would you have had the courage to risk your family's safety to expose a conspiracy that was putting other workers' lives in danger? Would you have been willing to go up against some of the most powerful people in American business to protect people you had never met? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you and made you think about the importance of standing up for what's right, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming stories of courage, determination, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And don't forget to watch our next recommended video about the mason who discovered a secret buried for 50 years that changed his life forever. You won't believe what he found hidden in the walls of a house that had been abandoned since the 1940s.